Welcome to the Scrum Sessions podcast. Here in Dallas, I am Q, and over there in Berlin, my good friend Girion.
Hi, everyone. Good to have you back.
Okay, he never says a lot when we start, then he starts talking after that. Yeah, I know. He never says much when we start. Okay, guys, so we were talking before we started the podcast recording, and one of the topics that's coming to my mind a lot is, do we need a scaling framework? Do we really need a scaling framework where we can scale teams into multiple teams and multiple organizations? Do we need a scaling framework? Now I'm going to start with the German guy. What are your thoughts? Do we need a scaling framework? Because I am not sure.
So before I answer that, I actually just want to bring up something. So today we had a training class, Q and I, together on Scrum at Scale. And there was a participant, very cool guy, and he said, hey guys, I really like the podcast so much. I listen to it when I cycle, and you know who you are when you listen to this. And, it's so funny. Girion seems to be the level-headed guy, and Q is Q. And I was like, yep.
Q is Q, right?
Yeah, Q is Q.
Okay.
That's spot
Q
on.
is Q. Okay. So I'll take the rep. I'll take the rep. I'm the loose cannon, I'm the guy who has no brakes, no filter, no nothing, which is true. But in my mind, my friend, I don't know if we really need this thing called a scaling framework. Are we just looking for a scaffolding for stuff that we don't know how to do? Are we overcomplicating? So I'm not there that we really need one. So
okay,
let's talk about it.
Yeah. Okay. So hard disagree, because I think we absolutely need scaling frameworks. Because what happens if you don't have them, right? Everyone is going to constantly reinvent the wheel. And when we use this expression to reinvent the wheel, we act as if it was simple, right? So let's assume the wheel was invented in ancient Egypt. I don't know where it was invented. Let's say it was invented there, right? And you're in China. Is it simple to come up with the wheel again? No, of course not. It's a tremendous invention, and it's very difficult to arrive at it if it hasn't been invented yet. And this is actually what I'm seeing at a lot of customers. They are not familiar with a scaling framework, and then they try to do it by themselves, and usually it doesn't look all that great. And that despite the fact that often the Scrum practitioners doing it are quite experienced, right? They're very good Scrum Masters, they're very good product owners or Agile coaches. But because they don't have the specific training and skill set in how to scale and know which pitfalls to avoid, they will actually then reinvent the wheel, but it's not going to be nice and round. It's going to be one of those crazy wheels that we sometimes see in cartoons and stuff, where it's actually, has 4 sides to it and it's like super bumpy and stuff. And so in my opinion, we absolutely need scaling frameworks, because otherwise people will just reinvent the wheel, and not in a very good way.
Yeah, but you see, maybe I'm going from the point of view of somebody who has a lot of experience with that, right? But in the end, if you're going to talk specifically Scrum, right? Scaling Scrum is basically scaling all the events, right? And scaling is basically communicate, coordinate, and synchronize, right? You have to communicate with everybody else. You have to coordinate with everybody else, especially if you have dependencies, right? Or even if you don't, you have to exchange information. Hey, we learned how to do something. You guys should know about that. And then you have to have a synchronization so everybody deliver things when they're supposed to do. So when you look from my point of view, it's basically just doing all the events is scaling. So you have a scaled version of the daily Scrum. You have a scaled version of planning. You have a scaled version of retrospective, and you have a scaled version of sprint review, right? And the sprint itself is scaled because there are multiple teams in there. So from my point of view, maybe because I've done this so many times, in the end, it's just scaling everything. So if you know how to do one thing, you know how to bring it up one level. Maybe you agree, maybe you disagree, but that's the way I see it.
So I agree with one point, which means I basically disagree, is I think you're a master in this field, right? So you're an SPC in SAFe, you're a Scrum at Scale trainer, and you probably have a ton of certificates and experience in the other scaling frameworks as well. And so I think it's it's easy for us, because this is our specialty, to be able to break it down to very simple terms. And I really like what you just said. What was it? Coordinate, synchronize, and communicate. Maybe not in that order, right? I think that's a very smart way to look at it, and I think you're probably right. But this is kind of like very high level principles thinking, right? If you already know all the techniques, then you can move on to the principles, and then you can boil it down to that. And I think you're totally right. But the problem is the people that are doing the scaling in the real world, on the front lines, they don't have your experience, right? And so what comes to mind for me is this Shuha-Re thing, where, well, yeah, you're already on that Re level where you can like look at it and you can immediately see it. You can probably look at the different scaling frameworks and immediately see the strength and the weaknesses and see like where they align and so on. But the problem is that the people out there doing it are usually beginners, at least at scaling, right? And so if we don't give them the scaffolding, they are probably just going to go crazy and they'll build something that's really strange. And to give you one example, and this is actually a very minor thing. I think it's very natural that this happens, and this is not a big problem. But so let's say you have two Scrum teams, right? You're just at the beginning of scaling. What organizations will often do is say, okay, so now we have two Scrum Masters and two product owners, so why don't they basically do the meetings together, right? So they might have something like a scale daily, and then all of them come together because it's just for people and it just makes good sense for all of them to talk together, right? And this works as long as you have two teams and maybe three teams, and it's innocuous enough, right? People will do it, it'll work. Because you're on this high level, you'll immediately know where I'm going with this, and that is the question, what happens if I have 10 teams, right? And so if I have 10 teams and, or let's just say 8, like somewhere there, and I put 2 Scrum Masters and 2 product owners into the scale daily, already I have like 16 to 20 people. Then add another coach, maybe add somebody from management because you want to resolve impediments immediately. And suddenly this thing stops to scale, right? So at the very beginning, at the beginner's level, putting all of them together into a meeting, it worked well. But as soon as you truly start to scale, things will break. And my assumption is, or my thinking is, because you know this, you see this immediately, you know exactly where I'm going with this and where this is going to go. You know when to amend the system a little bit. But the problem is, those that are not as experienced as you are, they will not notice it. They don't know what is a good way to do it. And then they'll be sitting there in their scale daily, for example, have 10 product owners there, 10 Scrum Masters, maybe even 10 developers, 3 people from management, 2 coaches, and they're going to be surprised that nothing is working, right? And they're going to say, oh, well, 15 minutes is not enough. Actually, 45 minutes is not enough. And most of the people are just sitting around and don't know what to say or do.
Okay. I would put something else in there.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the requirements for scaling, and whether you're not use a framework, I'm still not convinced on the framework stuff, right? Is you have to understand the basics and you have to be very good at practicing the basics. You need to understand the principles behind it. You have to understand how to apply those principles with practices, right? So one of the things that fails miserably in scaling, framework or not, is people tend to go into, oh, it's very simple. Hey, somebody gave me a cake recipe to do scaling. You do this, you do that, and a pinch of this, a pinch of that, a little bit of nutmeg here, a bit of cinnamon, and all that stuff, and then it doesn't work. And every time it didn't work, and I was called in there with my red suspenders and firefighting gear, right? It's because people forgot to first get really good at the basics. Because the reason I always say, well, you don't need a framework is, think about this, right? If you do a scale, if you do a daily Scrum, and you're really good at doing that, 6 to 8 minutes, right? Normal. Seldom you go to 15, right? 6 to 8, that's what most teams, really good teams do. They bang, 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 we need to organize discussions later, da-da-da-da-da. Oh, we need to pay attention to this. Hey, can I help somebody? I need help. Bang, you're done. But then when you scale, you have to have the same thing in mind, right? You're going to have representatives of each team on that thing that you may call whatever the framework call, but it's a scaled version of the daily Scrum. It's the same principle. You have to exactly adopt the same principle. So if you don't know how to do a team level, the moment you have 40 people in the room and 17 teams or something like that, it's not going to work. It doesn't matter what scaling framework you're using. So you have to master the basics.
That is true, in my opinion, to a certain extent, but I think that's easily said looking backward, right? If you're like trained, almost overtrained in scaling frameworks, it's easy to look back at a lower level and say, well, it's kind of obvious because two things. The first one is I've seen a lot of experienced and really good coaches like Scrum Alliance CSCs make exactly this mistake, right? And they were actually good coaches. And, as soon as scaling became part of the equation, they did exactly that mistake and had like everyone in every meeting, and the scaling just didn't work. It was just completely wasteful, and the information that needed to be communicated wasn't communicated. So like if I look around myself to people that at least at the time were more experienced than I was, they still committed that error. And so it seems like it's not totally obvious even to experienced people. And if I'm truly being honest, I'm quite arrogant about my skills as a Scrum Master. I think I'm a damn good Scrum Master. And could I have, in my fantasies of being the best Scrum Master ever in the world, could I have developed a scaling framework, let's say like Scrum at Scale? I'm so arrogant, I would actually like to believe it, but I think it would have taken me 20 or 30 years of experimenting and failing, and like then realizing at some point of time, well, actually, if I want to do it really right, I have to use the principles that you were saying that are true for team level Scrum and have to apply them to scaling. And I think it would have taken me forever, despite the fact that I'm actually pretty good at this stuff. And if I look at SAFe, for example, and it absolutely has its use cases, but they're not doing that, right? They're not using the principles of team level Scrum and then just expanding them to the whole organization. They're building a lot of other stuff around that, right? And so I'm not saying this doesn't work, but people in practice don't come to that conclusion. I think it would have taken me forever, if at all, to come to that conclusion. And it would have created so much chaos on the way to figure it out. And I would actually much rather consume the result of somebody very smart, in this case, Dr. Jeff Sutherland, who has like created it, and then consume it and then see, well, does it work or does it not work in my specific context? And lastly, there's actually different approaches to that, right? So SAFe does work in some contexts. And so there seems to be more than one solution. And so this is like, for me personally, this is too tricky for me personally. And then also I think people don't have the time, Scrum practitioners don't have the time to like create this stuff. And you're just very good at this. So I think this is really the thing.
Yeah, I may become a believer in what you're saying for one reason. When we first did Scrum, this was back in 2006, there wasn't a lot of information around, was because, you see, Q is the loose cannon. So Q decided, well, we have a couple teams anyway, so let's try this thing. Right? And it did work, and it did work. A lot of people got surprised that it worked, but it did work. And then we had multiple teams. So we had to have some kind of communication, coordination, synchronization mechanism. And probably somebody told me, hey, there is all these things in here that you should be aware of, which I have to learn the hard way because I had no freaking clue what I was doing. I don't know if I can say freaking on the podcast, but anyway.
You can.
Yeah, I can. I had no clue what I was doing. I'm the first one to admit that. But I found ways to do that with my teams, right? Now, I will tell you, if somebody had told me a few things that I didn't know ahead of time, yeah, I would benefit from that. I'm still not sure if I need a formal framework from that. What I need is the knowledge and the awareness of some things. For instance, we were having this conversation in Scrum sessions today, right? Well, you have this line manager, you have the Scrum Masters, and where one ends, what the other one begins, right? And I was mentioning it, I had a situation where we got a chief Scrum Master to coordinate a group of teams, each one of their own Scrum Master. And the person freaked out because suddenly they have to DOA. I have to buy hardware. Somebody lost a laptop, I have to get another one. hey, 2 people just quit. Now we have to hire another 2 people, right? And all these things, I don't know if scaling frameworks actually address those. And those are things that need to be dealt with, right? So, yeah, I see a lot of good things about Safe and Scrum at Scale and others, right? Everybody has good ideas in there. But I don't know if you need to follow those things by the book. And I don't know if even if you follow those things by the book, they actually teach the people sort of running the show things that are, we can call administrative, right? Staffing, budgeting, and all that stuff that suddenly people get faced into that is like, what do I do now? Does a scaling framework solves that? I don't know. Does it?
That's true. However, I would say Scrum doesn't solve all these practical problems for on the team level either, right? And I personally actually don't want my scaling framework to solve everything. This is actually why I'm more on the side of Scrum at Scale than Safe, for example. Like I said, I see some use cases for it, but for me, there's too much stuff in there, right? And then they'll say, it's a toolbox. Yeah, it's nice, but I actually don't need like a myriad of tools. I need a very condensed set of things that are offered to me that I can use. And then the practical stuff, I'll figure it out along the way, right? And because you could start adding more specific stuff, let's say to Scrum at Scale, but at some point of time, you're probably going to overload it. And I think it would be very difficult to figure out where to stop and what to include and what not to include. And I actually think Safe is like nearing that point where, for some people, it's really good to have this complete set of things. But at some point of time, it can become too much.
Yeah, there are arguments there are pros and cons about that, right? For instance, in my view of Safe, right? If you come from a very traditional organization where people trying to figure out what this agile thing is,
yeah.
It's a cake recipe, it's a black box, you can follow it, and you get stuff done, right?
Yeah.
And it's much better than what you had before. There's no question about it, right? We always talk about twice the work in half the time, right? It's much more than that, because you didn't have anything. However, and I've been to piles of Safe shops and worked in many of them. I'm telling you, 1.5 years, 2 years inside it, if you are still doing exactly by the book, by the recipe, you are actually not benefiting as much as you did in the beginning. Now, I also hear the counter-argument from leadership about Scrum at Scale, that you look at Scrum at Scale site and there's nothing in there. That's too thin, right? So I agree that Safe has too much stuff. Scrum at Scale has too few things. Even Kanban now, I just looked today, and Kanban now is talking about OKRs, right? And because they need something to align the teams, and Kanban doesn't really provide that, right? So there are some practices that you're going to end up needing, whether or not you have a framework. Now, can you put every single practice on a box? Probably not a good idea, because people are going to be confused to what they really need and when they need it. And if you don't put anything, maybe it's a bit too thin. And when you don't put a lot of things, again, it goes back to my point that you need to have a lot of knowledge of the basics on how things work, because otherwise you may not actually adopt that really well, because there isn't the so-called perfect recipe, or at least a startup recipe. So I'm starting to agree with you that I think we need some sort of framework. I get really worried is it too much or is too little? Where's the balance in there that somebody who doesn't have a lot of experience can actually take advantage of that? And somebody who has a lot of experience say, well, I can use something in here, but mostly we've been doing this some other way and has been working, so let me think about it. So I am not too much against the framework anymore, the idea of having a framework. It's what's in there and how much is in there.
Yeah. Let me just still pile on with the frameworks, because I think they provide two additional things that we haven't touched on yet. And the first one is, okay, so you're a master at this, right? And so if people know that you're a master in this, they can hire you. But if you get run over by a car tomorrow, for example, you're not going to be available anymore, and your knowledge is going to be gone, right? And by having a framework, that means somebody has to put it into paper or some form of expression, right? They have to put it down to share it with others. And so suddenly it's not in your head anymore. It's not in my head anymore. It's not in Jeff's head anymore. It's out there, right? And so first of all, it'll survive us, first of all. And the second thing is, as soon as it's out there, it goes from subject, from being in us, to object, and somebody can manipulate it, right? Somebody in Japan can look at it and say, this is so stupid. You guys didn't think of that and that and that, right? And then we can have a discussion about it. And so then we not only take it outside of ourselves and make it possibly live for a much longer time, but also we can increase the capability, right? And maybe even though you're a master, you haven't thought of everything, and then somebody points it out and you're like, oh yeah, never had this in my situation. This actually makes sense. I'm going to change that too, right? And I think this is really critical. So it'll make it live longer. It'll increase the quality because you have a lot more eyes on it. And also, let's not forget, it's much easier for people to access it, right? So if they don't know that you're the expert in it because you have done this for 20 years by yourself without a framework and have actually achieved a high level with it, where do they go? But if I have a framework, I can go to the website, I can read some material, I can book a class, and suddenly I'm already on a certain level with very minimal effort, right? Even if you have to pay for a 2-day class, right? It's not for free, but then still you're already a good level. If it's not there, basically, the only way I can achieve a decent level of knowledge is if I start scaling and repeat all the mistakes that everyone else has done.
Yeah, well, they can learn from the Scrum sessions, or you can watch the podcast. I'll give them my experience in there. I for once, I'm gonna agree with you.
Yes, everyone, please mark this in your calendar.
There is that one time they agreed with him. We actually agree on a lot of things. We're just joking around.
Yes.
But the thing is, I think people have to be careful with frameworks, right? I criticize a certain framework because it fails to acknowledge that Kanban teams exist, right? Scrum is not the solution for everything. And I had people telling me, but Q, we cannot mix Kanban and Scrum teams. I said, I've been doing this for God knows how many years, right? Well, but Kanban teams don't have a sprint. I said, so what? Every 2 weeks they tell the group what they got done in the past 2 weeks, And we are planning. They know they are there in the planning event. They know what they have in mind. They try to tailor their flow to the things that people are doing, etc. And they come to the scaled version of the daily Scrum every day. They say, hey guys, your stuff is being done, is done, is not done yet, or that's why. So it doesn't prevent from non-Scrum teams to be part of scaling. And some frameworks take this hard-nosed approach that is this way and is the only way, right? And we have to think that agility is about being flexible, right? And adaptable. If you're just going to say, well, it's not going to work because these people are not doing Scrum, that's a really bad way to go about things, right? And Scrum is not the solution for everything, and neither is Kanban the solution for everything. Some people tend to think that one thing resolves all the problems. That would be, at best, wishful thinking, right? So I will buy into the framework, but I think the framework has to serve purpose, which is communicate, coordinate, and synchronize. If you just say, if you're not doing Scrum, you are no good, you are probably going to have a little bit of a problem down the road. Don't you think?
Well, this is actually why I like Scrum at Scale, right? And so if people listen to me in the context of being a Scrum at Scale trainer, it might seem like, oh, well, he's the trainer, he's trying to sell a system or whatever. But I actually did Nexus, which is one of the other frameworks, before I ever heard of Scrum at Scale, right? And I was actually certified in another system before I ever heard of Scrum at Scale. And so I actually see advantages in all of the systems and disadvantages as well. But there are a couple of things that really pulled me towards Scrum at Scale, and which I actually think it is the best system, and which it is the system that I implement at customers. And I always, like when I do it, I always feel like, well, this goes so seamless. I wonder why not everyone is doing it, right? And so one of the things is, and I mean, we've been teaching this for so long and we've talked about it in the book and so on, is that it's actually fairly simple to attach Kanban teams into a Scrum at Scale system, right? You just have to make sure the interface is working, right? And so you can do that via service level agreements. And this is actually, so like before Scrum at Scale, what I would often encounter is if you go to a large organization, they usually already have a couple of different implementations, right? There might be Kanban and there might be Scrum, and they're like in competition a little bit. There might be some part of the organization that has chosen to scale Scrum with less, and another part that has chosen to scale Scrum with Nexus. This usually happens because you have agile bubbles all over the place. But now with Scrum at Scale, I actually find it much easier not to get into these brother wars, right? Where the agilists that are actually trying to make the organization agile start instead fighting each other, right? Instead of turning the organization agile. Because you can subsume like different parts really easily. So there are 5 teams and they want to work with less. Fine, I don't care. Let's sync them up and we can just attach them to Scrum at Scale. Or we have like Kanban being used in HR, for example, in people ops. Cool, I don't care. It fits in very nicely. We have to make sure that it feeds the system right, that there's no problem at the interface. But I actually think this is the big advantage of Scrum at Scale, that you can like add so many different ways of working. Of course, ideally, I want to have everyone work in Scrum if that's feasible in their context, but usually it's not. And I'm surely, if people are working successfully with Kanban, I'm surely not going to go there, especially not me as a Kanban trainer, right? I'm surely not going to go there and say, hey guys, you're working successfully with Kanban, but you need to change to Scrum, which you don't know anything about. It's awesome. They're being agile. Let's integrate it into the whole system. And this is actually what I like about Scrum at Scale.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you there. I think the Scrum at Scale idea is very simplistic and it's very easy to understand because it's very simple, right? And I had situations in the place that we had people Scrum at Scale, safe and less, right, in the bubbles. And we had a bunch of Kanban teams too. The only thing we had to do was to harmonize the language, right? So Scrum at Scale has this awful name called Scrum of Scrum's Master. Which
I don't like it either.
It's awful, right? And so we just called everybody RTEs and that's it, regardless if they're using safe or not, because it was simple. I had other cases, we just called them Chief Scrum Masters, which I prefer. Because we have Chief Product Owner, we have Chief Scrum Master, there's parallelism in there and everybody gets it. But one of the things is the first thing I changed, and when we're teaching, you are not in that segment, I said, guys, I don't use this name, Scrum of Scrum's Master, and then it gets worse. Scrum of Scrum's Master. That takes half an hour just to try to explain who you're talking to, right? So I like to change the name, right? That's the first thing I do. But when you have different frameworks, we can adopt just one term and everybody knows what it is. Okay, that's the person who coordinates a group of teams. What are going to call it? Oh, let's call it RTE is the term that most people use it anyway.
Let's not do that. Let's please not use RTE.
I honestly don't care what it is. For me, what matters is, do people understand what the role is supposed to be doing, right? Jokes aside about calling RTE or not, I prefer Chief Scrum Master. I prefer Chief Scrum Master. I think is the easiest way to understand because it's a Chief Product Owner, right? So regardless of the framework, in the end, is the same thing, right? Somebody has to coordinate the product owners. Somebody has to coordinate the Scrum Masters, right? Again, that's part of it. So what you call it, I don't care. I think everybody can work together because in the end is about coordination, communication, and synchronization. Now, I'm going to give you that unless you have a lot of experience like some of us do, you probably need guidance in how to do that. What I don't want is the scaling framework to become some sort of untouchable thing that, we cannot deviate this much because the book says so. And there is one framework in particular that it tries to brainwash everybody to never change anything, no names. And it's not true, because even long-term trainers of that framework told me the same thing I knew. After a year and a half or 2 years, you need to start tweaking things because you know better. You don't need those crutches, to keep you propped up and all that stuff. So in the end, I can accept the concept of a framework as long as it doesn't become a crutch.
Yeah. Awesome. All right.
I think that's it for today. And I'm going to do my usual thing. From Dallas, I am Q, signing off. And then the guy in Germany signs off at the end. He always gets the last word, and he hates me because I always do that.
Yes. So goodbye, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. Remember, you can find us on all the podcast platforms, on YouTube and so on. If you've just listened to this episode as your first one, there's already quite a few episodes out there, and we produce one of them each month. And there's also the Scrum sessions that Q was referring to. They happen on every first Thursday of the month, and it's a live session. It's free. It's Q and me, and you can just come in for an hour and just ask questions. Or if you are a little bit shy and don't want to do that in the beginning, you can just come in and listen to other people ask questions, and then we debate that stuff. So stay tuned for the next episode pretty soon, and take care, guys. Bye-bye.